First, I do need to give a required disclaimer that our debaters tonight represent their own views. They do not necessarily represent the organizational views of the Secular Student Alliance and Ross Christie at A&M. This is an opportunity to explore different thought perspectives. So if you disagree, then let them have it. Okay. In the interest of time, we'll go ahead and get started. So our speakers tonight are Ewan and Michael, and I believe Ewan's going to go first.
Yes.
Okay. Let me pull up your slides real quick. And you can start.
Cool. I come over here so I can actually press my buttons.
Yeah, and put the lapel mic on. You can probably just put it on your tie. It would hold about a certain level.
Nice.
Yeah.
Do I have the big boomy voice now? Ooh, nice. Okay. This will be good. All right, well, we will get started. I'd like to start by giving a big thank you to Ratio Christie for hosting this event. The members of Ratio Christie are very awesome, in my opinion, and I would like to thank them for their continuous support of open and honest discussions. While we might not always agree on every issue, the importance of respectful discourse and intellectual honesty cannot be overstated. It's something that, in my opinion, they have that I'm increasingly appreciative of. Well, I don't believe me or Michael will be pulling our punches here today. Don't let that confuse you into thinking there's any lack of respect among the speakers up here tonight. We're here to talk about the facts of evolution and how to interpret them. Evolution is a scientific theory that explains the history and diversity of life on Earth. It is a powerful theory that provides insights into the behaviors, distributions, and origins of species on our planet. In biology, the process of evolution refers to the change in heritable characteristics in biological populations over successive generations. These characteristics are in the expression of genes, which are passed from parent to offspring during reproduction. Variation tends to exist within any population as a result of genetic mutation and recombination. Evolution occurs in the evolutionary process when factors such as natural selection, sexual selection, artificial selection, or genetic drift act on this variation, resulting in certain characteristics becoming more common or more rare within a population. Evolutionary pressures determine whether a characteristic becomes more common or more rare in a population. The factors that determine whether characteristics are becoming more rare or more common are constantly changing, resulting in a change in heritable characteristics arising over successive generations. It is this process of evolution that has given rise to the biodiversity at every level of biological organization. Today we'll be exploring two specific variations of evolution, naturalistic and theistic evolution. Naturalistic evolution can be understood as the concept that evolution occurs within our natural universe without any involvement of supernatural entities. Naturalism is the belief that the natural universe is all that exists. And to keep things simple, the natural universe just refers to all the physical stuff. Anything, any hypothetical substance that's not made of physical material is not a part of the natural universe under this definition. And a scientific theory is a body of principles that explains some collection of facts and observations. Some people like to say evolution is just a theory, but a scientific theory is not just merely a hunch or hypothesis. They can be facts. So we have to talk about the burden of proof. Positive claims require positive evidence. I, in this debate, will be supporting two positive claims tonight, that the natural world exists and that evolution happens within this natural world. And I will have to satisfy my burden of proof to show it. My opposition claims that the supernatural exists and that the supernatural is involved in evolution. In order to win this debate, they will have to satisfy their burden of proof to present positive evidence to support both of these claims. Failing to do so would flow to the negative. I will now attempt to satisfy the burden of proof that evolution happens with 6 lines of evidence if I have the time for it. First, DNA comparisons. The genetic code for DNA provides some of the strongest evidence for the shared ancestry of life on our planet. By comparing the DNA of different species, we can determine how closely related they are. For example, humans and chimpanzees share over 99% of their DNA. Without a common ancestor, such similarities are inexplicable. This is especially interesting when we talk about junk DNA. What is junk DNA? It's DNA that has no effect on an organism's traits. As organisms evolve, they tend to accumulate this junk DNA. If man and chimps had been created and had been microevolving separately, we would have expected them to have accumulated their own junk DNA. And if they had evolved from a common ancestor, we'd have expected that common ancestor to have accumulated junk DNA and then pass it on to both man and chimps. Well, it turns out that humans and chimpanzees do share almost all of their junk DNA, and the odds of that happening without a common ancestor are approximately 0. Secondly, comparative anatomy. Some species share similar physical features indicative of a common ancestor known as homologous structures. An example of homologous structures is in the forelimbs of vertebrates, such as the arms of humans, the wings of birds, the flippers of whales, and the wings of birds. Despite having different functions and appearances, the basic bone structure of the forelimbs is very similar, indicative of common ancestry. 3, the fossil record. The fossil record provides evidence for evolution by documenting the existence and changes of now extinct species and how they're related to us. For example, the evolution of horses is well documented in the fossil record, showing a progression from smaller multi-toed ancestors to single-toed descendants over a million years, indicative of evolutionary theory. 4, embryological evidence, or species distribution. The global distribution of organisms has unique features that are reflective of evolution, such as the phenomenon of island speciation. The Hawaiian Islands, for example, have been isolated from other landmasses for millions of years, allowing for independent evolution to occur. And as a result, unique species in Hawaii are found nowhere else, which is not easily explained without evolution. 4, embryological evidence. Many traits in one kind of animal appear in the embryos of another kind of animal. For example, fish embryos and human embryos both have gill slits, which is not easily explained without evolution. 5, evolution observed. We can directly observe evolution in organisms, especially those with shorter life cycles. For example, researchers have documented the rapid evolution of fruit flies that were able to survive higher and higher levels of exposure to pesticides, which is a clear example of evolution occurring within a relatively short period of time. And finally, the predictive power of evolution. When we look, an essential requirement for any good theory, scientific or otherwise, is the ability to predict phenomenon. When we look into the fossil record, we see a sequence of animals in what we might call the tree of life. And as one might expect when you're looking at old records, there are some pieces that appear to be missing, a gap. So scientists got to thinking about this. There's lungfish that jump from pond to pond in Florida and end up in people's swimming pools. And then there are these amphibians and toads croaking around. And scientists thought if there might be a species that shares the characteristics of both. Over the years, people have found in Canada that there was clearly a fossil marsh, a place that used to be a swamp that had dried out, where you find all kinds of happy little swamp fossils there. And people realized that with the age of the rocks in this continent, as computed by traditional science, this would be and that happened to align with the age where we would expect this common ancestor to have existed, and that therefore this would be a reasonable, good place to look for this fossil. And indeed, scientists found Titilak, this lizard fish guy. So in other words, the theory of evolution made a prediction about something that would come true, and lo and behold, it did come true. Currently, the alternatives to evolution do not have this capability. And while we talk about the evidence for evolution today, please understand that I am only scratching the surface of all the evidence that does exist. At some point, you start having to ask yourself, what is more likely? That all the evidence for evolution has just been completely made up? That of all of evolution's predictive power, its explanatory power, all of the great insights it's been able to offer have been the result of sheer dumb luck? Or maybe is it more likely that the theory of evolution actually happens to be true? If you haven't thought about that, I hope I've given you a chance to do so today. Nice on time. It's yours now.
All right. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming today. Welcome, you're just on time for the cool part. Especially I see some of the debaters who just came from a debate that happened upstairs, so it's a lot of debates to be going through today. But thanks to the SSA for out-competing our members and being here. But other than that, this debate is a bit weirder than a usual debate is, I'm sure. My opponent's opening statement there wasn't attacking me. Our first two speeches are just nonpartisan. We both will generally agree with everything that's going to be said in these first two speeches. He probably disagrees with my speech more than I disagree with his. And the next speech that I do right after this will be the start of the debate. Anyways, let me begin. Imagine for a second that you're a god. A 5-year-old asks you why figs fall when they're dropped. Do you answer with A, Newton's laws of physics, B, Einstein's field equations, C, the future complete laws of quantum gravity that no one understands, or D, I did it? So, most people are going to say, yeah, D, because kids can't understand these things. And I think that when speaking to those who do not understand, and when saying things that are just factually correct, there's no reason to do anything otherwise. God would be telling this child that, nope, it wasn't a water god that made the fig fall, or a fig god, and so God is keeping correct in everything that happened with the fig. This is in essence exactly what happens in Genesis 1 through 11. God blatantly and unapologetically thrashes every nearby ancient Near Eastern religion with subliminal messages while explaining in language that is understandable to the people of the time why they exist and how. Unfortunately, Americans today are 3,000 years disconnected from this culture, and generally we think much higher of our intelligence than is true. So we will assume that how we read scriptures, just opening it for the first time, is how everyone has read scriptures. And this hyperliteralistic reading is quite new, despite what many have taught. So, when you go back to our oldest commentaries on Genesis, our oldest is 500 BC. This is a Jewish debate on whether or not there were people who existed before Adam. You're not going to find something like that in modern young earth creationist. But you'll find that scholars living during the time of Christ, like Philo of Alexandria, held to a non-literalist view. The majority of church fathers whose scripts we maintain today, like St. Irenaeus, taught views in which one day is like 1,000 years to God based on 1 Peter. And the recently deceased Michael Heiser has documented very many of these, and I just wanted to mention him because his passing was terrible on all of us. But on to more happy notes, the first actual full commentary written on Genesis was written by St. Augustine. And the reason St. Augustine wrote it was because, like many people today, the thing that was keeping him away from Christ was that he couldn't get behind the stories in Genesis. They didn't seem right to him. And so, after studying with St. Ambrose, he got it explained to him and wrote numerous books on the subject explaining to people in their context how the anthropological depictions of God within are totally inconsistent with otherwise Christian doctrines. That was further elaborated by William of Conches in the 12th century, who showed that when it says Adam was made from dust, what that means is formed by natural processes and mortal, and that's what it means everywhere else in Scripture. So I don't have time to elaborate on everything that goes on within Genesis, so send in all the questions you want. But the main point I'd like to make is there was a real strong tradition of young earth creationism in the early church, but the leader of this tradition is Saint Basil of Caesarea. And how did he defend this? He said, quote, "Let the waters, it is said, bring forth abundantly moving creature that hath life and fowl that may fly above the earth and the firmament of heaven. Why do the waters give birth also to birds? Because there is, so to say, a family link between the creatures that fly and those that swim. In the same way that fish cut the water using their fins to carry them towards, and their tails to direct their movements round and round and straight forward, so we see birds float in the air by the help of their wings. Both endowed with the property of swimming, their common derivation from the waters have made them of one family." So that's a young earth creationist in 379 AD giving one of the first exploitations of a modern model of evolution in recorded history. And things like that continued until around the early 1900s when the Seventh-day Adventist movement began to popularize the view that the earth was 6,000 years old based on their heretical prophet apparently having a vision in which he saw the earth be created in 6 days, and also aliens. So they also said aliens exist. But that view, until then, and when it was very popularized in the 1960s based on the book The Genesis Flood, it is not at any point in church history since, that's my time, but not in popular dogmatic sense, so that's my point. And now we will begin the actual debate. Yay. So I will be now defending biblical theism, that there is an orthodoxly conceived monotheistic God who governs creation according to his goodness and ends, against naturalism, that no goal-oriented or intentional substances belay our fundamental reality, or however Ewan would like to maintain his previous definition. So, what does this predict? It says God, being intrinsically good, can never improve, but improvement is good. So God, being good, desires to make all things develop the goods, and since an improvement is a good that he would want to see, creates things that can improve since he cannot. Thus he creates an imperfect world that can move towards perfection. And metaphysical naturalism will simply predict that all actions in the universe are fundamentally indifferent to good or bad. So, I will assume for the rest of the debate that up until the point of evolution, these explain everything for them equally well, so we don't have to discuss anything else. So first, I will provide an evolutionary argument for design, and then after an evolutionary argument against. I'll be taking an innocent until proven guilty stance on general perceptions in this debate, so I'll be defending the innocence of design inferences and later the guilt of naturalist ones. So first, that the world appears design isn't really disputed. This man here, Richard Dawkins, fully agrees. Robust studies have found that belief in purpose in nature is present at a young age and persists in professional scientists at the same rate as those in the humanities. The question is whether evolution makes this an unshakable intuition that can be denied and guilty or not. I'll be arguing it does not. The first question is whether the innateness of human belief in God helps or hurts theism. The naturalist will say the adaptability of false religious beliefs explains why they're more prevalent than seeing color. Whereas I say that it's a natural sign which causes us to perceive God in all of nature as we were designed according to Romans 1:20, which says, "For since the creation of this world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse." End quote. And riddle me this, if one of the most universal beliefs held by all humanity throughout all time has been completely false, but heavily selected for by evolutionary pressures, how confident are you in your beliefs if you only get beliefs through evolutionary pressures? More on that later. Now I have a new question. What's cooler? You find a watch on the ground, fully designed the way it is, or a little baby watch, and watch that little baby watch grow out into a whole kingdom of clocks. My opponent will say, watches don't have baby watches, or so he thinks. But this silly example still shows the design inference is not itself undercut by gradual progression alone. So what's my next question? What's a better parenting strategy? There's kind of all over the place, I'm sorry, but so a guided but random journey to adulthood, or skip straight through the tutorial to 18. Evolution allows for growth, and so the goal of theism to make humans who grow and can develop also seems to encode free will into nature, and free will doesn't really fit in a naturalist worldview. Now let's get into science. So convergence in evolutionary theory. The famous paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould, famous for disproving phrenology, that's skulls and race, said in the 80s that, quote, "We could wind back the tape of life and the chance becomes vanishingly small that human intelligence would grace the replay." But as new data came in, he changed his mind. Evolution is strikingly convergent. 2- and 3-toed sloths haven't been related for 30 million years. That's the only difference between the sloths. They're sloths. So hummingbirds, hog moths, also unrelated. Bats are not birds. Whales are not fish. Photosynthesis has evolved independently over 100 times. Eyes, 49. By the time he died, Dr. Gould had completely changed his mind, saying instead that I worked piecemeal, producing a set of separate and continually accreting revisionary items along each of the branches of Darwinian central logic until I realized that a Platonic something up there in ideological space could coordinate all these critiques and fascinations into a revised general theory with a retained Darwinian basis. So our evolutionary history isn't a dice roll that could have just had any result, but, quote, "There are trends within evolutionary history that might reflect the existence of general principles governing the evolution of increasingly larger and more complex forms." That's Sean Carroll in 2001. This model is used by Google's AI, instead of the functional neo-Darwinian model, as the preferred method for studying protein folding today. That's Sparks 2022. And researchers at Yale and Columbia found significant evidence last year while studying independent plant evolution with predictive algorithms that evolution is not nearly as random on the macro scale as was thought in the 80s. perfectly predicting the evolutionary history of plants in 9 out of 11 biomes. According to the author, quote, "The findings demonstrate how predictable evolution can actually be, with organismal development and natural selection combining to produce the same forms again and again." So what does this tell us? Evolution is not as random and blind as individual mutations would lead us to believe, but reveals a complex tapestry of simple forms moving towards more advanced forms. There is an invisible hand to evolution. So I end with this section with a quote again. "We knew of old that God was so wise that he could make all things, but behold, he is so much wiser than that he can make all things make themselves." From Charles Kingsley in 1874. And I'll make my evolutionary argument against naturalism. So I argued that design inferences are innocent. Now I will argue that naturalist inferences are guilty. So here's my argument. First, if evolutionary naturalism is true, then beliefs, if they exist, do not change behavior. 2, evolutionary selection pressures cannot differentiate between true and false beliefs if the resulting behavior is the same. So if EN is true, then we have reason to doubt that our belief in EN is reliable. Thus, EN is a self-defeating belief. Premise 3 and the conclusion follow self-evidently in the same way that saying, "It's raining, but I don't think it is self-refuting. So I will focus on defending premise 1. So why might we believe that behavior and belief aren't related? Under naturalist models, physical things always have a purely physical cause. That causes a big problem since, long quote, sorry, on naturalist assumptions, mental events have no causal consequences and thus invisible to evolutionary selection. A mental event consists of some substance instantiating a mental property or entering into a mental relation. Causal closure, however, guarantees that the physical characteristics and responses of the organism are completely accounted for by other physical events, so there's no independent role left for mental events to play. The selection pressures are entirely physical in nature, so they can only operate on physical features of the situation, not on any mental event that may happen to be going on. That's Hasker in 2022. In other words, behaviors cause beliefs, but beliefs don't cause behaviors. To clarify the distinction between a mental thing and a physical thing, imagine that you could know the entire brain structure of a bat echolocating something. Would you then know what morbing time feels like? Didn't think so. And this isn't just some weird philosophical argument. According to neuroscientific research, beliefs are post hoc rationalizations of how your body has already begun to act. As determinists point out, your brain works 300 milliseconds to up to 10 seconds faster than you start to form beliefs on what you're doing. If our beliefs, which are mental events, don't cause our behavior, which is a physical event, then EN has no reason to select true beliefs over false ones. Truth is wholly irrelevant to the 4 Fs. You all know them, say them with me. Feeding, fleeing, fighting, and waiting until marriage. You'll notice each is a behavior. In the words of atheist metaethicist Sharon Street, just as the push of the wind and tides on your boat has nothing to do with where you want to go, so the historical push of natural selection on the content of our evaluative judgments has nothing to do with evaluative truth. All natural selection requires for humans to act in a way conducive to survival is that humans have indicators to control behavior. The vast majority of these indicators, like blood pressure, work on autopilot. Even bacteria will have indicators driving them towards food, but they don't have beliefs. Neither do horned frogs, nor longhorns. One might object that beliefs are in some way essential to higher order thinking like math, but my TI-84 provides a decisive counterexample. To avoid confusion, there might be a straightforward naturalist account of why we have a brain state caused by a physical impairment that causes us to behave in a way to avoid pain or hunger or whatever, but there's no naturalist account of why there is then a belief superfluously tackled on to that which explains why we already did what we did. I've tried to keep this as simple as I can, but if you want a more rigorous approach, mathematical physicist Chetan Prakash has proven the fitness beats truth theorem in evolutionary game theory simulations, establishing that a creature evolved solely for fitness with zero visual beliefs always fares better than one with only true beliefs. That's Prakash in 21. And from here, the story's simple. If each belief we have is effectively a coin toss, then the probabilities of humans having mostly reliable beliefs, say 2/3, for 1,000 independent beliefs is basically random. That would be a lucky 1 in 93.5 octillion. So the beliefs which previously justified EN are thus all called into question, so the theory cuts off the branch it was sitting on. This only gets worse when we attempt to assess truths of naturalism and other weird abstract questions like, is evolution best explained by the Bible or atheism? So according to, oh, that took too long making jokes. That's too bad. That was my last slide anyways, but.
This one?
Oh yeah, we just gotta press through all our evidence once again. There we go. All right. And do I have a microphone?
Yeah, right here. Right here. Yeah, put it in the same place.
Cool. I get the big boomy voice once again. Ooh. All right. Well, we'll need to get started immediately for purposes of time. I have a lot more time than I did on my last speech. You notice I had to talk quite quickly. I had to explain what evolution was and all proof of it in 7 minutes. I'd first like to start by thanking my opposition for a great speech. I learned something, both listening to that and preparing for it, which is always a wonderful thing. In this debate, I will be arguing 4 main points. That theistic evolution is just a bad theory, that naturalism can better explain certain features of evolution that theism cannot. Thirdly, that Christian theology is inconsistent with what we now know about evolution. And finally, that while theistic evolution has its problems, intelligent design suffers from those same problems and worse, and to a much greater extent. Therefore, if the affirmative has failed to demonstrate theistic evolution, the next logical step would be a move towards atheism, not a return towards intelligent design. So firstly, theistic evolution is just a bad theory. I will be giving 4 reasons for this. Oh no, my check marks have disappeared. Those are supposed to be check marks. That's kind of sad. Otherwise, it looks a little bit silly, doesn't it? So I'll give 4 reasons why theistic evolution is a bad theory. Firstly, it is poorly defined. One of the main criticisms of theistic evolution is that it lacks a clear and precise definition, which makes it very difficult to evaluate its truthfulness. It neither offers a detailed mechanism for how divine intervention interacts with evolution, nor provides any evidence for when it actually occurs, and therefore it cannot be considered a robust theory. Secondly, theistic evolution lacks falsifiability. One of the fundamental requirements for any good theory is the ability for it to be falsifiable, meaning there must be some conceivable observation in the experiment that would prove the theory false. Theories that are not falsifiable are rejected out of hand. Theistic evolution lacks this attribute because it does not specify when and how divine intervention occurs, making it immune to empirical testing. Furthermore, the proponents of theistic evolution often result to shifting goalposts whenever observations do in fact conflict with their beliefs, rendering it unfalsifiable. Thirdly, it lacks positive evidence. Theistic evolution, well, doesn't have a lot of evidence in support, has plenty of evidence in support of the evolution part, but it's severely lacking in the evidence for the theism part. I defined positive evidence in my last speech. I will define it here as direct proof, distinguishing fact from falsehood. It is distinguished from circumstantial proof, proof that if believed indicatively establishes the truth or falsity of a fact and does not arise from presumption. We have plenty of positive evidence to support the naturalistic influences in evolution, such as natural selection or sexual selection, but there's no documented phenomenon where we see divine intervention occurring. And if it is, I ask where it is. And finally, theistic evolution has no power, predictive power. One of the hallmarks of any good theory is its ability to make testable predictions. Natural selection, for instance, has made numerous predictions that were later confirmed to be true in observation and experimentation. Consistently, theistic evolution has not made any testable predictions that have been corroborated. In conclusion, I would like to leave Michael with the following challenges. What can you predict? What can you predict based on theistic evolution that I cannot predict based on naturalistic evolution? And if the answer is nothing, I would suggest that your theory has unnecessary assumptions. My second challenge would be, how do I falsify your theory, right? I mean, what observation can I show you that would actually show that your theory is false? And finally, what evidence do you have, right? What's the direct proof of divine intervention occurring within the process of evolution? And if the answer is nothing, I would suggest that your theory is unsupported. For my second contention, I'll be arguing that evolution has certain features which are well explained by natural selection, but are inexplicable under theistic evolution. I propose 4 reasons for this. Firstly, continuous evolution. The fact that the idea that evolution was created with the purpose of producing modern-day humans conflicts with the fact that humans and other animals are still evolving to this day, as evidenced by persistence of genetic mutations in human populations. The continued evolution suggests that the continued evolution of humans and other animals suggests that evolution is not a complete process, but is instead an ongoing process without a predetermined end or goal point, which fits better with naturalism. Secondly, observed unguidedness. Theistic evolution proposes that mutations may not always be truly random and can be influenced and pushed and pulled by divine intervention. However, scientific experiments have consistently shown that mutations are indeed truly random. Proponents might argue that God's hand in influencing mutations is mysterious and unobservable, and thus we should not expect to see non-random mutations. However, if God's hand in directing evolution is completely unobservable, unmeasurable, indistinguishable, and indifferent from a world with no divine intervention at all, then how is that different from God not actually being involved at all? Thirdly, Occam's razor. The principle of Occam's razor suggests that when faced with multiple explanations for a phenomenon, usually the simplest explanation is the correct one. Since theistic evolution does not make any observable or measurable distinctions with natural selection, Occam's razor would favor natural selection because it is the simpler theory requiring fewer assumptions. And fourthly, animal suffering. And I totally stole this from Ken Ham. He made a great image here, and I'm totally going to steal it. Evolutionary theory implies that there has been an unimaginable amount of suffering, pain, and death throughout the billions of years of life on Earth, all of which occurred, or much of which occurred long before the introduction of humans and sin into the world. This raises a number of defeaters to the existence of a loving God. Firstly, why would God allow so much innocent animal suffering to take place, especially since animals are incapable of suffering or doing wrong? And secondly, if God did create the universe with the purpose of creating modern-day humans, why would he design an evolutionary process that involves so much death and pain, especially given that humans and sin did not appear until relatively late into the history of life on Earth? Animal suffering is perfectly consistent with naturalism, but remains inexplicable under theism. For my third contention, I'll argue that Christian theology contains certain features which are inconsistent with what we now know about evolution. To start, I'm going to go with Adam and Eve. The story from the book of Genesis documents the creation of the first humans and their subsequent fall from grace. It's seen as foundational narrative in Christian theology as it explains why sin is involved in the world. However, this story creates three big issues when we also understand evolution. Firstly, there was never any first pair of humans in the world, right? Human species evolved gradually over time. Secondly, the story claims that death entered into the world after Adam and Eve sinned. However, from evolution, we know that animals were suffering and dying long before Adam and Eve could have ever have existed. And thirdly, it brings up big issues with timelines. So evolutionary theory requires billions of years for life to evolve, and there is overwhelming evidence of an old Earth. However, an old universe appears to be in conflict with certain biblical passages. So we can look at the genealogy of Jesus as it relates to Adam and Eve. We find this in Matthew and Luke. And the problem here is there's only 75 individuals that seem to separate Adam from Eve, or Jesus from Adam and Eve. And so if you do a little bit of math by looking at the ages of those characters as described in Genesis 5, for example, and you add them all up, you'll find that the universe can only be 6,000 years old. And that presents quite a few big issues, right? Because, well, the universe is clearly not 6,000 years old. There are trees that are older than 6,000 years old that you can visit that are still alive. So it seems, and evolution, of course, relies on billions of years to work. So this remains inconsistent with evolution. Secondly, general revelation. So this comes from Romans chapter 1. The purpose of this verse is to sort of answer, like, why do non-Christians go to hell, right? Why is God doing this? Or at least why don't they go to heaven? The central premise appears to be that non-Christians are evil people. They know God exists, but they suppress it in their wickedness. And part of this is Romans 1:20, which we just heard, which explains that, yeah, you can see creation everywhere. But this is inconsistent with what we know about theistic evolution, right? Theistic evolution describes God's hand in the process of evolution as being indistinguishable from naturalism. Well, if it is on the one hand indistinguishable, it can't on the other hand be clearly seen. And so it would appear to be violating Romans 1:20. And if God's handiwork is clearly seen in evolution, then why is it so hard for you to produce evidence of it, right? If it's clearly seen, bring it to me, show it, right? It should be there. So theistic evolution seems to be in conflict with this verse. And finally, while theistic evolution has its problems, intelligent design has those problems and more. All of the criticisms I've presented here of theistic evolution are also valid against intelligent design, but intelligent design tends to suffer from them to a greater extent. The problems with timelines, the severe lack of evidence, and the lack of predictive power are more significant issues, actually, in intelligent design than they are in theistic evolution. And additionally, theistic evolution actually is in line with evidence, where ID is not. So, in conclusion, in my first speech, I showed that intelligent design conflicts with the vast evidence in support of evolution in old Earth. And in my present speech, I talked about how theistic evolution attempts to reconcile these issues, but faces significant challenges. And therefore, it cannot be considered a better theory. In my last 15 seconds here, I'd like to, again, re-emphasize my challenges to Michael. What observations can I present to you that would falsify your theory? What actual proof do you have of when God has intervened in the process of evolution as you predict? And what can you predict on theistic evolution that I can't predict on naturalistic evolution? And if it's nothing, I think your theory is unsupported, unfalsifiable, and invokes unnecessary assumptions.
I'm bringing this up so I can actually read my thing. Here, got the timer good? Alrighty, so I'll start with the problem of bad design since it was my opponent's best argument. My opponent's argument had 3 parts. Animals suffer. This suffering has lasted for millions, maybe billions of years, and it was not necessary for some greater good. For the sake of argument, I'll grant all 3 of these are true and show that these alone are insufficient to justify the conclusion that animal suffering is unjustified. Now, I'll argue Christians can believe evil may still be justified, even if unnecessary, so long as it was possible for it to be ultimately defeated by the sufferer. I'm going to give a zoomed out picture of why God might allow for evolutionary suffering based on this. Biblical theism teaches that our fallen world is on the road to perfection, as I've already stated. See Revelation 21. Sanctification, or the process of being made holy, is a process we participate in. So curing our own illnesses, correcting our flaws and biases, exterminating all mosquitoes, that's on us. We live in a fallen world, redeemed through Christ and his saving atonement. Thus, a biological model where the chaotic becomes organized fits with that nicely. In fact, outside of random evolution, it's hard to explain how God could ensure creatures' freedom and not engage in coercion. So keeping all this in mind, let us begin. The narrow dimensions of good and evil in our universe are conducive to higher goods such as empathy, bravery, and moral agency, only possible due to the existence of sentient creatures capable of experiencing pain. And on top of that, the Bible promises an eternal new creation later for these great goods to be cultivated in, so that creatures develop the power to defeat and overcome the evils they experienced in the first life. Not merely being compensated, but drawing us closer to God and more grateful for his creation and affirming that we wouldn't have had it any other way. Contrary to many popular pictures, the point of Christianity is not to escape and fly away to heaven, rather is the hope for a new redeemed physical creation. So why are we ordered to subdue the earth if they're all going to disappear, no more animals? After all, if we have a shared ancestry with animals, we can surely shepherd them into a shared future. I see no reason the lion and the wolf can't lie down with the lamb in the new creation, as is described in Revelation. If animals are conscious beings who do experience rudimentary pain, then they can surely see rudimentary virtues in this world. See Harambe. They can then improve those during a literal infinite afterlife for the rest of time to fully recover. The distribution of pain and pleasure we see is exactly what to expect if the goal of nature isn't just hedonism, but union with God. Crucially, it's not just God saying, I burned down your house, here's a bigger one, but a system in which the risk of temporary suffering is permitted to allow intrinsically good states of affairs such as freedom, and additionally to allow for the availability of eternal benefits to any being who takes that risk. So yes, all dogs do go to heaven. Now I'll address the rest of the points more or less in order. My opponent's first argument was theistic evolution is a bad theory, and not really a lot of sources, but allow me to clarify with an example from my own constructive, Stephen Jay Gould. Someone in contrast to the intelligent design blog, which he didn't tell you was his source, but was in his opening statement on the thing, someone who is actually respected by all scientists, originally proposed that evolution is unguided. They could roll the tape back and get a new result each time. No direction, no purpose. Gould was wrong. He admitted he was wrong. Be like Gould. TE predicted purpose. TE remains correct. My opponent made no effort to explain why naturalism actively predicts evolution to occur, much less that it would have the direction I pointed to in my first speech, nor does saying my theory is just a science resolve the issue, since that's like saying a gun killed Lincoln. This naturally flows into the next question. How can a random process be guided? Short answer, go to Vegas. Long answer, randomness just means the genes aren't aware that they're engaging in selection. Duh. He used 2 studies that he didn't give y'all. He didn't cite any of his sources to y'all. That was so mean of him. So, maybe because both his studies involve a guided random process where we put the samples in a controlled environment to watch them go. That's how you have a guided process that's still random. Remember the sloths. The sloths, there was a reason the sloths came back together. Millions of years of fossil record are how you looked for this, not just, it looks random to me. And now, there's other questions that might come from this, like, he says, there's something wrong with it being a long time ago. Why is there so much time for death to occur? But God's not an Aggie engineer. He has infinite time and infinite resources. And if dinosaurs were cooler than us, he has plenty of reason to keep them around for millions of years and us for not that long. So I don't think we need to have an anthropomorphic view of history, even if we are chosen to be in God's image. This is God's world, not ours. So to answer my opponent's 3 main questions, where does God directly intervene? He doesn't. He doesn't need to tinker with the system. You don't only tinker with the system if something's wrong. He doesn't design a poor system. God is the sustaining cause of all things at all times in existence. There's nothing special about evolution. What falsifies my theory? A good argument against God, unreliable human factories, only a divergent evolution. Basically anything that was a main argument in my original statement, if it's completely wrong, that's going to hurt my theory. And what did I predict right? Prevalence of convergent evolution, true human belief. And now onto we were supposed to have nonpartisan openings, but my opponent decided to challenge that with a fundamentalist reading of Scripture. I'm a little disappointed. But mostly boils down to, was Adam the first human? So yeah, Paul says Adam's the first man, but he also says Jesus is the last man in the same sentence. Notice how I was born after Jesus, though. So, on original sin, there are many competing views in Scripture for how sin came in, and it's underdetermined by Scripture. However, Jesus is clear that death of the soul, not physical death, is what's to be feared. That's in Matthew 10. A more popular approach is Adam and Eve were the prototypes of the first priests of the temple. They were specially elected humans, different but not unique and separate from all the rest. Where Adam failed, we succeed. That's all the Bible needs you to know. So give me one scholar, please. Just any Old Testament scholar who agrees with you.
I actually know how long I'm speaking for. I got 6 minutes. Hang on. Okay, there we go. So in this rebuttal, I'd first like to start by thanking my opposition. It was another great speech. In this rebuttal, I will be addressing how beliefs do affect behaviors, in contrast to what my opposition says, and what was fundamentally wrong with my opponent's syllogism, which would have suggested otherwise. And I'm going to also explain why convergent evolution, therefore God, is not a sound argument. And then if any time left, I will go over everything else that I heard tonight. Let's start with the obvious. Beliefs affect our behaviors, right? Presumably, you're all here tonight, and presumably that has something to do with your belief that coming to this event would be worth your time. Presumably, if you didn't believe this event would be worth your time, you wouldn't be here. Right? Presumably, my beliefs are affecting what I'm telling to you right now, right? If I believe different things, wouldn't I be up here saying different things? So, intuitively, clearly our beliefs affect our behaviors, right? So, what went wrong with the syllogism here? Well, to find out, we're going to have to take a little tour into theory of mind, a little philosophical crash course for you. So what is a theory of mind? Well, our mind refers to our mental states, our beliefs, our desires, our conscious experience. And a theory of mind attempts to explain, like, what is that? Like, where does our consciousness belong in reality? Like, what is it exactly? There are a lot of different theories of mind that we could talk about. The two most relevant and important ones to this debate are functionalism and dualism. Dualism is the belief that, like, the mind and brain are completely separate entities, right? You got your brain and your body, and then your mind over here, and they're separate, right? And then there's functionalism, which claims that the mind is a product of information processing, right? Your thoughts and beliefs come from your brain. And if your brain stops processing information, you stop being conscious, and there's all scientific discoveries there. My opponent is a dualist. I mean, that's evident from the way that he's speaking here, right? He talks about mental events and physical events as separate entities. I and most other naturalists are functionalists. You can separate all these theories of mind into physicalistic theories of mind and anti-physicalistic theories of mind. Physicalistic theories hold that the mind is a physical entity. It's made of matter and energy. It exists somewhere in space. And anti-physicalistic theories involve that there's some non-physical substance involved. Well, have you seen the problem here? Give you a second. Michael's main syllogism here relies on that dualism is true as an unstated premise that he has in his syllogism, right? That dualism is an accurate description of the mind, which this whole argument keeps talking about this separation between physical brain states and mental events. But you'll notice that dualism is in the anti-physicalistic theories of mind. Well, if you assume as a premise an anti-physicalistic theory of mind, you're obviously going to conclude that the physical world is not all that exists. If you assume as a premise the existence of this mental substance, this non-physical mental substance that exists outside the natural world, you're obviously going to conclude that naturalism is false. But that would just be an assumed conclusion, right? It begs the question, right? Like, is dualism a good theory of mind? The answer appears to be no, and I thought Michael seemed to agree with this because I think he sort of propped up dualism as if it was a naturalistic belief and then teared it down. But I mean, he's the dualist, not me. And so one of the arguments he gave against dualism is actually one of the oldest arguments against dualism. It was first presented by Queen Elizabeth in 1643, a very old argument, which basically states if the mind is made of purely mental stuff, then how does it affect our bodies, right? How do we make decisions? In other words, beliefs do not affect actions, right? But that contradicts our first-person experiences, right? When we're walking around the world, we think of us choosing to do things, right? But that's inexplicable under dualism. Under dualism, your body is just this automaton walking around, and you're getting carried along for the journey. But that's not the experience we have, right? I am talking to you. I'm choosing to talk to you, right? This isn't expressed, and this is what Michael says himself as well. Under functionalism, however, our brains do affect our bodies, right? If brain and the mind are one and the same, your brain is affecting your body, there's no issue here. So is functionalism true? Is there any good evidence for that? Well, there is. One of the main claims of functionalism is that conscious experiences are multi-realizable. That is to say, there should be many different ways of producing conscious experiences. Dualism claimed the opposite, right? The original dualist, Descartes, said, animals are not conscious, right? They don't have souls. But we can run a test for this. We can look at animal consciousness, and the evidence is overwhelming that the animals are conscious. So that functionalism made a prediction that came true, dualism made a prediction that came false. But because dualism, as always, is an unfalsifiable theory, they just shift the goalposts and they don't claim it. My opposition claims that, brought up that there's convergent evolution. Eyes have evolved many times. This is good evidence for God. I propose an alternative explanation for why eyes have evolved many times. Premise 1, eyes are useful. Premise 2, natural selection will favor traits that are useful. And in conclusion, natural selection will favor the evolution of eyes. You don't need Platonic ideals to explain it. You just need some common sense. So to summarize here, because we're getting out of time, my opposition that natural evolution cannot explain rationality in our minds relies on assumed conclusions. If they explicitly said the evolution can predict why brain states are truthful, well, under functionalism, truthful brain states are truthful beliefs. He admits that there is no problem here. And then further, my opposition's argument that convergent evolution would prove God is also deeply flawed. as always.
Okay, we have 1 minute of cross-examination each, which I know isn't very long, but
Oh, shoot, is this yours? I'll just take mine then. Well, just, that's why you can drink it.
You might want to move your chair. Are we moving chairs? Are we keeping that over there, or move it here?
okay, so 1 minute. Mike, you want to start?
I'll just ask one question. What is non-reductive physicalism?
Non-reductive physicalism. I don't know, I'm sure you could educate me.
I'll do that in my close.
Nice. All right. Get my, I guess I could timer out, right? 1 minute. All right, to start, you said we live in a fallen world. When did the world fall?
So the world fall, based on your calculation, it said anywhere from 3774 to 4004.
All right, so about 6,000 years ago. Why was there animal suffering before the fall?
Well, for that, I'm just going to say that's not a particularly nebulous form of suffering. Animals suffer. That's what they do because they eat each other, and animals do as they're designed, and they live the lives that they're meant to. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. I think they live most of their lives perfectly happy. The problem that I think is the real issue is what is the suffering for which there is like moral culpability, and I don't think moral culpability really comes in until after the fall, and so that's what I focused my argument on. I'd say all the animals before that just go straight to heaven and they're all chilling.
Thank you. What can you predict on theistic evolution that I can't predict on naturalistic evolution?
I ran out of time and didn't answer your questions. That is terrible. I had them all planned out. All right, so I did, didn't I? No, I gave my thing. I said I can predict that we have beliefs that correspond to our behaviors, and I can predict.
We're out of time, I guess.
Okay.
Someone can ask you, I guess, you know. Like,
Yeah, I really spent time complaining about answering the questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, we're going to do Q&A now. You can submit your questions up here if you would like. I've got some. If you would like to raise your hand, we'll do it like this. Raise your right hand if you have a question for Ewan, and raise your left hand if you have a question for Michael, and raise both hands if you have a question for both of them.
Wait, right or left? For you or the audience?
For you.
Okay.
Yes. Raise the hand corresponding to the speaker. I'll go ahead and get us started with some of the forms that were on here. So, and we're going to alternate. So we'll start with this question for you. And so the universe could have been created yesterday by God, and we wouldn't be none the wiser. So how does showing that evolution is correct with our current knowledge disprove the existence of God?
Right, I mean, this is a philosophical. All right. So the universe could have been created last Thursday by God. He would simply be deceiving us. Among many other things, it would be unfalsifiable. It wouldn't be useful. It wouldn't make predictions. And it would also rely on the idea that God is purposely deceiving to us. He's very much so lying, right? If you produce a word that looks like it's billions of years old, but that's not billions of years old, that's a form of falsehood. It's a false of lying, right? Why would God be trying to trick and deceive us in such a way? It's also an unfalsifiable theory that we could reject out of hand.
Yeah, comment on that.
I agree.
Okay, question for Michael, then we'll go to the audience here. So the claim that beliefs do not form from any physical or naturalistic occurrences disregards neuroplasticity and physical changes that occur in the brain as one learns new material. Long-term potentiation reinforces beliefs, behaviors that result in favorable results. We can even cause beliefs by artificially activating brain circuits. So how do you explain no physical changes occurring or causing new beliefs with all the data showing that there are measurable changes that occur to cause these?
Now I'm kind of sad because I felt like I made this clear, but I do not deny in any way that under naturalistic functionalist models that a behavior causes a belief. So I'm totally fine with saying behavior causes belief. The problem is the beliefs it cause, are they true? Because in order to argue that A, neuroplasticity is evidence that beliefs cause behavior, You have to beg the question for the naturalist and assume naturalism is true. Because if naturalism is not true, this provides a perfectly reasonable functionalist account by which, under theism, functionalism is true and yet we both have true beliefs. You have to provide an argument for probabilistically why would we expect this type correlation to have existed under a world that's utterly indifferent to whether or not we exist, when deterministically how we would actually behave doesn't change.
Okay, question for you from the audience. You at the very back there. Yes. Oh, sorry, for Ewan on the left. Oh, okay, all right. I'll go to you then. Yes. Go ahead.
So this really is so much a question maybe you can clarify. So, what's your name again?
Michael.
Michael. So Michael, said that like the fundamentalist thing about the Earth being 6,000 years old is not canonical outside of that particular sect of Christianity. But then you mentioned like the 6,000 years between Adam and Christ. Are you saying that the Earth is 6,000 years? Are you saying that he's saying that, or are you saying that evolution is somehow relevant after the creation of Adam, is at the tail end of the creation story?
It's an excellent question. Firstly, it's actually worse. It's 4,000 years between Jesus and Adam and Eve. It's 6,000 years total, because Jesus lived 2,000 years ago. The point is to show that, firstly, among other things, the Bible's very inconsistent, right? There's so many contradictions you can find in so many different places. And one of the humorous things this causes when people debate about the Bible, he can bring up Bible passages pointing to an old Earth, I can bring up ones that point to a young Earth. No, we just have to disagree. It's like, well, maybe it's just a contradiction, right? Maybe the Bible on the one hand says it's young, and then the other hand says it's old. The Bible passages there are, to me, is the most clear evidence, right? It's the genealogy of Jesus. There's no possible way to interpret this as poetry. It literally just says, Jesus, son of this person, son of this person, son of this person. It's the most boring, it's just a record, right? But, you add them all up, there's only 77 people. You add up the ages of all of them, you find that the Earth is 6,000 years old. Or maybe Adam and Eve existed, and then the human species started 6,000 years ago. Both of these claims are just absurd. There's no evidence for them. And it's not a coincidence that people, a lot of Christians think the Earth is 6,000 years old, right? Like, where did they get that idea from? Well, they didn't make it up, right? They got it from these Bible passages. And so it's to show that the Bible seems to be wrong. It's inconsistent with what we know about evolution and the rest of reality.
All right, quick follow-up. The word son there means descendant, same way for son of David, father Abraham. Second, if we say Adam wasn't the first person, this is all irrelevant. Third, he's going to say, I don't know what young earth passages he points to. I will respond to every single young earth passage and explain why it doesn't say what he says it does. He still hasn't given me a single Hebraic scholar who exists today who believes that we should read the Bible like he did when he opened up for the first time. I will go through every contradiction y'all could possibly point at me, and I will do that whenever y'all want.
Okay, question. Go ahead. Michael.
Question for Michael. So your argument against natural selection is basically, let me paraphrase it, you're basically saying that under a naturalistic framework, we should not expect true beliefs to be the ones that evolve. Is that correct?
I'm a bit more radical than that. I'd say part one of it is I'd say it's a mathematical theorem that beliefs that are irrelevant to truth and solely to survival always outcompete beliefs that are based towards survival. Beliefs that are based towards truth. So that is a case, but the more important part of it is the question of if your belief is a side effect of a physical process and you exist in a deterministic system where that belief always occurs after you've already started to behave on it. That belief is always behind your action and can never catch up. So you're fully determined. Someone from the outside you is never going to be able to tell the person who's just an automaton living his life and doing all this stuff versus the person who's the exact same but actually has beliefs corresponding to their
Well,
actions.
that's a dualist theory of mind. Because if it's a naturalist theory of mind, there is observable ways to tell. But they actually.
It's non-reductive physicalism,
But
which
I
is...
have two things. So first off, I think it's true that truth and usefulness are more correlated than not. And then also, it's not true that all of our beliefs are true. We actually do observe plenty of wrong beliefs within humanity, right? And sometimes that clashes with the modern world. And so both of those are evidence, I think, that the mind is naturally made. Because first, it doesn't line up entirely with truth, and second, truth lines up with usefulness, so you should expect some true beliefs to arise in a natural framework. The randomness thing doesn't matter if the box that is shaped towards truth, right? Truth is useful, and so it makes sense that a mind which values usefulness would also value truthfulness to some extent.
Well, maybe to some extent,
Response to
but
that?
also I pointed out too, if you're a naturalist, I pointed out in my start of my speech that then evolution shows that religion is going to be a very odd counterexample, because religion is more common than having properly working eyes.
Yeah, maybe it's one of those false beliefs that's useful.
This isn't Q&A, not back and forth. Do you have a quick comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, several things. I hear a lot of dualist assumptions in there as well. Again, you talk about how religion is selected for by evolution, but that's not true. That would be the naturalistic fallacy, right? You can imagine, like, 2,000 years ago, someone saying evolution selects for belief in feudalism, right? But that kind of wouldn't make sense, right? Like, the fact that it occurred doesn't mean that it evolved. And secondly, like, yeah, creatures evolved in the real world, right? It pays to understand how the real world works, right? The idea that, whether a belief is true or false has no bearing on, like, fitness and survivability is nonsense, right? I'm sure there was once a gene that said, tigers are our friends. Those genes aren't around anymore, right? They got killed off, right? Because it wasn't true. So, and as Sullivan, I think, just said, right, like, the fact that we do have some wrong beliefs is strong evidence against theism, right? Why would God design us with imperfect rationality and imperfect beliefs, and then punish us when we act on those irrationalities and imperfect beliefs? Right? Has God not designed all the Muslims with irrationality? Okay.
Sorry. We have one more question for you, and time for one more question. Yes, that's very bad.
So I'm a little bit confused as to why you keep mentioning dualism in this debate, given that Michael is an idealist and not a dualist and does not believe in any dualistic propositions whatsoever. So if you could give a little more clarity on that, that would be great.
Yeah, well, it's evident from his speech. I mean, he keeps talking about the difference between physical events and mental events. If he's an idealist, then him talking about physical events kind of doesn't make any sense, actually. So, I mean, again, it doesn't really solve the problem, right? I mean, if his argument presupposes idealism, which is another anti-physicalistic theory of mind, the assumed conclusion is still present. He's assuming the physical world is not all that exists by presupposing an anti-physicalistic theory of mind. It doesn't really solve anything, in my opinion.
I'll just say I'm not assuming dualism, I'm not assuming idealism, I'm assuming functionalism. I simply have actually read the Stanford Encyclopedia article that he cited in his speech.
Okay, we're going to go to closings now, so Michael will go first. And then I just want to comment, we'll stick around here for a few minutes after the event, and then we'll all go down to the fishbowl, which is under the memory cloud, which is next to the, y'all know where it is.
It's under the little
Yeah,
chandelier lights.
Yeah, and we'll stay there for a while. Do you have slides?
No.
Okay, I'll do this.
Everybody ready? Mostly the camera people. All right, so I haven't been politely thanking my opponent throughout the round, and I feel bad, so I will mention that Ewan has been way more busy than me this semester. He's like graduating, he's getting a job and stuff, and the fact that he pulled all these slideshows together, I didn't think he was gonna have a slideshow at all tonight, and so I'm very much impressed by the amount of work he managed to pull in the amount of time that happened. So, now on to my closing. I made two arguments in the round, an evolutionary argument for design and an argument against design. My first argument was that deep convergence and direction in evolutionary history point us towards our embedded intuitions about design and nature being true and not being disregarded by basic evolutionary knowledge. And my second argument was that if evolutionary naturalism only requires organisms to act to survive and not to have further facts of belief about their behaviors tacked on, then based on mathematical theorems, the assumption of determinism, and the standard interpretation of non-physicalist or non-reductive physicalism in the philosophy of mind, I prove that true beliefs are irrelevant to unguided blind evolution, and therefore we cannot believe unguided evolution is true. My opponent made his argument that beliefs affect behavior, and I agree, but that's because naturalism is false. Functionalism does not resolve this because if you scroll down on that Stanford Encyclopedia article, the first argument, actually the second argument you'll find against it is the argument from mental causation. Because non-reductive physicalism is the vast majority of views in physicalism and is the only proper functionalist view. That is the view that all mental events can be reduced to caused by brain states that are not separate. But there are mental events. To deny mental events at all is to deny color exists, to deny you have thoughts, to deny you have feelings, and to deny basically anything is going on in your head. Hence why reductive physicalists are known for saying you are a machine who doesn't have thoughts. You are a syntactical machine, not a semantic machine. That's Daniel Dennett, the only main reductive functionalist left in the world. So I don't assume dualism. I just know my opponent's arguments better than he does. And that's all there is to it on that. And my opponent then, he completely undercovered structuralist evolution and just said, yeah, it's useful, so it's true that you have eyes, but notice how I showed a theorem that your eyes providing useful information to you is more important than them providing true information to you. So my second argument undercuts any reply he made to my first argument. And so I wish him the best of luck in responding to my previous arguments in his final speech, but I don't think that since he has been on defensive the whole round of here is how I can maintain that these are equal and not made any positive defense of naturalism against theism, I think he's just on the back foot for the rest of the round, and there's nothing he made strong against my specific case.
Right. Let me get my microphone back on. I'll quickly go over some of the arguments that were made and then summarize. Yeah, he keeps talking about this distinction between true beliefs and useful beliefs. Useful beliefs are very often true beliefs, and true beliefs are very often useful beliefs. It's true evolution selects for usefulness, which selects for truthfulness. Unless you're going to claim that believing what's true is never useful, I don't understand how that can be the case. So to summarize the round, I think what a lot of Michael's arguments result from is just a straw man of naturalism, right? He talks about naturalism predicts that evolution is completely random. No, it didn't. It never has. Mutations are random, as I pointed out, but evolution is not. It's guided by natural processes such as natural selection that are not random. Like I said, eyes have evolved because they're useful. It's not a random fact that eyes evolved. Eyes were always going to evolve because they're always going to have been useful. It's just a common misunderstanding that evolution is completely random, which is a straw man. Again, he keeps talking about the distinction between dualism and functionalism. Again, under functionalism, right, true brain states are identical to true beliefs and vice versa, right? So to say evolution favors true brain states is to say it favors true beliefs. Your brain states affecting your actions are your beliefs affecting your actions. Those are one and the same. Again, this is just a common misunderstanding. So just to totally summarize here, in my first speech, I showed that intelligent design conflicts with the extensive evidence supporting evolution and an old Earth. Theistic evolution attempts to reconcile that with Christian theology. Theistic evolution attempts to reconcile Christian theology with the facts about evolution, but it faces significant challenges. Theistic evolution cannot explain certain features of evolution. It cannot explain animal suffering. It remains inconsistent with important theological issues while also failing to satisfy Occam's razor. And as far as theories go, it's a sloppy one, because it does not make precise claims, it does not make testable predictions, and it does not propose a way to falsify its proposals. In stark contrast, naturalistic evolution does not suffer from these issues. It is perfectly in line with the evidence. It's collaborated by one successful prediction after another, while continuing to offer one of the world's most successful and robust and well-tested explanations ever proposed. As a result, theistic evolution cannot possibly be considered to be a better explanation of observed phenomenon than naturalistic evolution. And again, I reiterate my challenges, right? What can you predict on theistic evolution that I cannot predict on naturalistic evolution? What actual proof do you have of when divine intervention has occurred? At the start of my speech, I presented the burden of proof, right? The burden of proof is on he who makes the positive claim. It's your burden of proof to present positive evidence, right? Evidence that is indicative exclusively of your claims above the rest. Evidence that's not presumptuous, that's not circumstantial. Is that what we heard tonight? Did we hear evidence that once you've heard this evidence, once you believe it to be true, you're left with no other option other than to believe theistic evolution? I don't think so. I don't think we heard that. And until that evidence is presented, we assume negative claims.